They threw me out of my own father's funeral. Not asked me to leave. Not pulled me aside quietly. Threw me out. In front of everyone. In front of the cousins, the aunts, the neighbors, the pastor. While my dad's body was still in the room. And you know what the worst part is? Nobody said a word. Nobody stood up. They all just watched. That was the moment I realized something. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is just a group of people who decided they liked your dad's money more than they ever liked you. But here's the thing they didn't count on. 10 years later, I owned every single house on that street. Every single one. I want you to stay with me for this whole story, because I promise you, by the end of it, you're going to feel something. Maybe anger. Maybe satisfaction. Maybe both at the same time. Because this isn't just some story about revenge. This is a story about what happens when people underestimate someone they were supposed to love. This is a story about silence turning into power. About humiliation turning into leverage. About a kid who had nothing left to lose, deciding to turn that into the most dangerous thing in the world. And if you've ever been counted out by the people closest to you, if you've ever been the one who got left behind, who got talked over, who got pushed to the side while everyone else grabbed what they could, then this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened to me and what I did about it. Before we get into it, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. We tell stories on this channel that you are not going to find anywhere else. Real stories. Raw stories. The kind that make you want to call someone you love or never speak to someone again. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the dramatic part, the quiet part. The part that nobody talks about because it doesn't make for a good story on the surface, but it's actually where everything started. I grew up in a house with my dad, my stepmom, and 3 stepbrothers. My mom had left when I was 4. I don't have a lot of memories of her. Just a smell, kind of like flowers and something warm. And then nothing. She was gone, and that was that. My dad was a good man. I want to make that clear because the rest of this story gets complicated, and I don't want you thinking he was part of the problem. He wasn't. He was actually the only reason any of us had anything. He worked his whole life in construction. Started as a laborer, worked his way up, eventually owned a small contracting company. Nothing massive, but enough. Enough to buy a house, then another one, then eventually help his brothers and cousins buy into the same neighborhood. He built something from nothing, and he was proud of that. The problem was that my stepmom never saw me the same way she saw her own sons. And when you're a kid, you feel that. You feel it in the way someone looks at you at the dinner table. You feel it in the way they talk about your future versus the future of the other kids. You feel it in the way they go quiet when certain conversations come up. I was never going to be one of them. I understood that pretty early on. But my dad, he always made sure I knew I was his. He would pull me aside sometimes, just the 2 of us, and he'd say, "You're my firstborn. Don't you ever forget that." And I held on to that. For years, I held on to that, like it was the only solid thing in my life. Because honestly, it was. When I was 19, I moved out. Not because I wanted to, not because I had some great plan, but because the tension in that house had gotten so thick that I couldn't breathe anymore. My stepmom had started making comments about how I wasn't contributing enough, how I was taking up space, how her boys needed room to grow. My dad would try to smooth things over, but he was getting older, and he was tired, and I didn't want to be the thing that tore his home apart. So I left. I got a small apartment across town, worked 2 jobs, kept in touch with my dad by phone mostly. We'd meet for lunch sometimes, just us. He'd ask about my life and I'd ask about his, and we'd pretend for an hour that everything was fine, that the family was fine, that none of the ugly stuff was real. But it was real, and it got worse when he got sick. My dad was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer when I was 26. He'd been a smoker his whole life, and it finally caught up with him. The doctors gave him somewhere between 1 and 2 years. He beat that estimate, lasted almost 3. But those 3 years were the hardest of my life, because that's when the family really showed who they were. The moment people found out my dad was sick, there was a shift. You could feel it, like a temperature change in a room. Suddenly, everyone was around more. The stepmom was extra attentive. The stepbrothers were calling all the time. The aunts and uncles and cousins were dropping by constantly. It looked like love. It looked like a family rallying around one of their own. But I knew what it actually was. They were circling, like they could already smell what was coming, and they wanted to make sure they were in the right position when it arrived. I kept showing up every weekend I could. I drove over and spent time with my dad. I'd sit with him, watch TV, talk about nothing and everything. Sometimes he was too tired to talk much, and we'd just sit there in quiet, and that was okay too. I just wanted to be near him. I just wanted him to know that someone was there because they wanted to be, not because of what was in his will. But every time I showed up, there was tension. My stepmom would get this look on her face. My stepbrothers would go quiet. Nobody would be rude, not directly, but you could feel the message underneath everything. You don't belong here. You're not really one of us. Why do you keep coming back? I kept coming back because he was my dad. In the last few months, when it became clear that the end was getting close, my dad asked me to come by one afternoon alone. Just me. He sat me down at the kitchen table, and he was very still. The way people get when they've decided something important, and they just need to say it out loud. He told me that he had set something aside for me. He said it wasn't much compared to what he'd hoped, but that he'd made sure I was in the will and that I would be taken care of. He said he was sorry that things had been the way they had been. He said he should have done more, should have pushed back more, should have protected me better. I told him he didn't have to apologize. I told him I was fine. He shook his head and said, "I know you're fine. You were always going to be fine. That's what I'm most proud of." That was the last real conversation we had. 2 weeks later, he was in the hospital. A week after that, he was gone. And that's when everything fell apart. And if you're still here with me, I already know something about you. You're the kind of person who knows what it feels like to be underestimated. Drop a fire in the comments right now if this story is hitting different for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what's coming next in this story is the part that changes everything. The funeral was 3 days after he passed. I found out about it through a text. Not a phone call, a text. From my stepbrother. It said the date, the time, the location, and nothing else. No. Hey, how are you holding up? No. We're all going through it. Just the information, cold and flat. Like I was some distant acquaintance they were obligated to notify. I should have read that as a warning. I didn't. I showed up in a black suit. I hadn't slept in 2 days. My eyes were swollen, and I was holding myself together with whatever was left inside me. I walked into that funeral home, and the first thing I noticed was that nobody looked happy to see me. Not sad happy the way people look at funerals when they're glad someone showed up. Just not happy. Flat. Like my presence was already a problem before I'd even said a word. I sat down near the front. I figured I had every right to be near the front. He was my father. The service started. The pastor spoke. People cried. I cried. And for a few minutes, I let myself believe that maybe this wasn't going to be what I feared it was. Maybe grief would make everyone human again. Maybe standing in front of his casket would remind people of what actually mattered. Then my stepmom leaned over to one of her brothers and said something I wasn't supposed to hear. I heard it. I'm not going to repeat exactly what she said, because I don't want to give those words any more air than they've already had. But the short version is this. She didn't think I should be there. She thought my presence was disrespectful. And her brother, this big guy, mid-50s, the kind of man who's used to people moving out of his way. He stood up and walked over to me right there in the middle of the service and told me I needed to leave. I looked at him. I looked around at everyone else, cousins I grew up around, aunts who used to feed me at holidays, people who had known me my entire life. Nobody moved. Not one person said anything. I stood up. I walked out, and the doors closed behind me, and I stood in the parking lot of that funeral home in my black suit, and I didn't know what to do with my body. I didn't know where to put my hands. I just stood there while my father's funeral happened without me, 20 feet away, behind a wall. I didn't cry out there. I was past crying. I was somewhere else entirely. I sat on the hood of my car until it was over. When people started coming out, some of them looked at me and looked away. One cousin, a woman I'd been close with as a kid, started walking toward me like she was going to say something. Then she stopped, looked back at her mom, turned around and got in a car. That was the moment I made a decision. Not a loud decision. Not a dramatic one. I didn't make any speeches. I didn't confront anyone. I just sat there on the hood of that car, and I made a quiet, private, completely serious decision about my life. I was going to be okay. And one day, the people in that parking lot were going to know exactly how okay I turned out. I drove home. I ate something. I slept for 14 hours. And when I woke up, I started working. Now, here's where I have to be straight with you, because this story isn't a fantasy. I didn't wake up the next morning and suddenly become a millionaire. That's not how this works. What actually happened was slower than that, and harder than that, and honestly, in some ways, more satisfying because of it. I'd been working in finance for a few years at that point. Entry-level stuff, mostly. But I'd been paying attention. I'd been learning. I had a decent understanding of real estate, of how mortgages worked, of how properties were valued and bought and sold. My dad had been a builder, remember? Some of that had rubbed off on me over those lunch conversations. He used to talk about property like it was alive, like land had a personality. He said the smartest thing a person could do was get between someone and their home. I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. I understood it now. I started small. I saved hard. I cut everything out of my life that wasn't necessary, and I put every extra dollar into learning and then into doing. I took courses. I found a mentor, an older guy who'd been buying distressed properties for 30 years and had seen everything. He taught me things that no YouTube video or college class ever could. He taught me how to read a neighborhood, how to find the properties that looked like problems but were actually opportunities, how to be patient when every instinct in your body is telling you to move. I was patient. For 6 years, I built slowly. First one property, then two, then a small portfolio. I made mistakes, real ones, the kind that cost money and sleep, but I learned from every single one. And I kept going. By year 7, I was doing well. Not rich, but solid. The kind of solid where you stop checking your bank account every morning because you already know it's fine. And that's when I heard about the neighborhood. See, the area where my dad had lived, where my stepmom still lived, where half my extended family had bought homes over the years because my dad had helped them get in. That whole area had been slowly declining. The city had shifted. New development was going up on the other side of town, and money was flowing away from that neighborhood. Property values had dropped. Some families had already left. The ones who stayed were mostly holding on, but barely. A lot of them were behind on their mortgages. I found this out the way you find out most things in real estate. Through research, through public records, through paying attention to what the numbers are actually saying underneath the surface. And what the numbers were saying was this. There was a portfolio of distressed mortgages in that neighborhood. A small lender had bundled them together and was looking to offload them at a discount because they didn't want the headache of chasing down payments from homeowners who were months behind. It was exactly the kind of deal my mentor had trained me to spot. I sat with it for a long time, longer than I would have sat with any other deal, because I knew what this was. I knew whose names were on those mortgages. I'd grown up in that neighborhood. I knew the streets. I knew the houses. I knew the people. I bought the portfolio, every single mortgage, every single property. I was now the lien holder on 12 homes in that neighborhood, including the home my stepmom lived in, including the homes of the uncle who walked me out of my father's funeral, and the cousin who turned around and got in her car. 12 homes, and not one of them knew it yet. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is different. Drop a comment right now, telling me what you would have done in my position. Would you have used that power or walked away? Let me know down there. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button, because the ending of this story is something you need to see through to the last word. For about 2 weeks after I closed the deal, I didn't do anything. I just let it sit. I went to work. I made my coffee in the morning. I lived my normal life. And somewhere across town, 12 families were going about their days, completely unaware that the person who now held the paper on their homes was the kid they'd thrown out of a funeral 10 years ago. There's something strange about holding that kind of information. It's not loud. It doesn't feel the way you'd expect it to feel. I thought I'd feel powerful, or angry, or satisfied in some sharp electric way. But mostly I just felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've been running for a long time, and you finally stop and realize you don't have to run anymore. I had a decision to make, and I knew it. I could be cruel about this. I could send notices. I could start foreclosure proceedings. I could show up at those doors one by one and watch the color drain out of faces I'd known my whole life. I'd be lying if I told you that image never crossed my mind. It did, more than once. But here's the thing about revenge that nobody tells you. The fantasy of it and the reality of it are completely different things. In the fantasy, it feels clean. You imagine the look on their faces, and it feels like justice, and it feels like relief. In reality, you'd just be becoming the worst version of yourself and handing them a story where they're the victim. I didn't want them to be the victim. I wanted something harder to argue with than that. So instead of sending notices, I sent letters. Not threatening letters. Not legal documents. Just letters. On plain paper. In my own words. I introduced myself as the new holder of their mortgage. I told them I was aware that many of them were behind on payments. I told them I had no interest in making their lives harder. And I told them I was open to sitting down and working out arrangements that made sense for everyone. Professional, calm, completely in control. The responses came back fast. Most of them were confused. A few were relieved. And then there were two that hit different. My stepmom called the number I'd included in the letter. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was polite in that tight, careful way people are polite when they're scared. She said she'd received my letter and she wanted to talk, and she hoped we could work something out. She didn't recognize my name at first. I'd been going by my middle name professionally for years. It wasn't intentional when I started doing it. It was just easier in certain rooms to not lead with a name that invited questions. But it meant that when she got that letter, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The uncle called too. Left a similar message. Calm. Polite. Very different energy from a man who had once put his hand on my shoulder in a funeral home and told me to get out. I called them back on the same day. I scheduled them back to back, 30 minutes apart, at a coffee shop about 10 minutes from the neighborhood. Neutral ground. My stepmom arrived first. I was already sitting at a table when she walked in. She scanned the room, didn't recognize me for a second. Then her eyes landed on my face, and I watched the moment it hit her. It moved across her expression like a slow wave. Confusion first, then recognition, then something I can only describe as a full system crash, like her brain needed a moment to reboot. She sat down across from me. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a long time. Then she said my name. Just my name, nothing else. I said hello. I want to be honest about what happened in that conversation, because it would be easy to make this the part where I say something devastating and walk out while she cries into her coffee. That's the version that plays well. But that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was quieter than that. She talked. I listened. She said things she probably should have said years ago. She didn't make excuses. Not really. Or maybe she tried to, and then stopped herself. She asked about my life. I told her it was good. She looked at the table a lot. At one point she said she was sorry about the funeral. That it was wrong. That she had let things go too far for too long. And that she knew my dad would have been ashamed of what happened that day. I believed her. Not completely, but enough. I told her I wasn't there to punish her. I told her I was going to work with everyone in that neighborhood to get their payments restructured into something manageable. I wasn't going to foreclose on anyone who was willing to communicate and make an effort. I told her that as long as she held up her end, she had nothing to worry about from me. She cried a little. I didn't. The meeting with my uncle was shorter. He walked in already knowing who I was, so there was no reveal moment. He just sat down and looked at me with this expression that was hard to read. Somewhere between respect and something he didn't want to admit to himself. He said, "You did well for yourself," I said. "I know." He asked what I wanted from him. I told him the same thing I'd told my stepmom. Pay what you can, communicate, and we won't have a problem. He nodded. We shook hands. He left. I sat there alone for a while after both meetings. Finished my coffee. Watched people walk by outside the window. I thought about my dad, about those lunches we used to have, about the way he'd look at me sometimes, like he was trying to memorize my face, about him sitting at that kitchen table in his last months, telling me he was proud of me. I think he would have had complicated feelings about all of this. He was a man who believed in family, genuinely believed in it, even when family let him down. He probably would have told me to be careful with power, to not let it make me something I didn't want to be. I hope I listened. Over the next 18 months, I restructured 11 of the 12 mortgages. The 12th homeowner, a cousin I'd never been close to, decided to sell instead, and I helped facilitate that too. Every single person in that neighborhood got a fair deal from me. Not a generous deal, not a charity situation, a fair one. The kind my dad would have recognized. I never moved back to that neighborhood. I had my own life by then, my own city, my own world. But I drove through it one afternoon, maybe 6 months after everything had settled, just to see it, just to sit with it. It looked the same as it always had. Small houses, quiet streets, the kind of neighborhood where people sit on porches in the evening and wave at each other. My dad built something there once, helped people get into homes they couldn't have afforded without him. Spent his whole life making sure the people around him had solid ground under their feet. I think about that a lot. I think about how the thing they never expected was that I was paying attention the whole time. While they were looking at me like I didn't belong, I was watching, learning, building, becoming exactly the kind of person who could one day walk back into their world, holding the thing they needed most. They counted me out at a funeral. I came back holding their mortgages. And the most satisfying part of the whole thing, the part that stays with me even now, isn't the power. It's that I didn't become what they were. I could have. I had every reason to. But I didn't. My dad was right about one thing. I was always going to be fine. If this story got to you, subscribe to the channel. There's more where this came from.